Now, so UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is barred from entering Israel. Foreign Minister Israel Katz accuses him of failing to condemn Iran for firing hundreds of missiles into the country. He further accused Guterres of backing terrorists and rapists from Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and now Iran. Israel says the UN chief hasn't made an effort to have Hamas declared a terrorist group. Guterres condemned the escalating conflict in the Middle East. But let's get some reaction now on the tensions in the Middle East with Shenilla Mohamed, who is Executive Director at Amnesty International South Africa. Shenilla, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, some of the incidents over the past few days have really got not just the Middle East talking and shocked, really, but also the world, the concerns of now what is seeming to be regional, more and more a regional conflict, and some even arguing that it is now a full going to be a global conflict as well. I think let's get your reaction firstly on some of the incidents that we saw, perhaps your thoughts on Iran. We saw launching 180 rockets towards Israel. Your thoughts there?
Good morning, Naledi, and good morning to your viewers. I mean, obviously, the situation in the Middle East is extremely concerning. And I think, the loss of life has been unacceptable in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Israel, and now in Iran. And definitely the situation is escalating. I think that, it's been literally what we're seeing playing out in the international stage is a for tat situation where you do something to me and I will do something back to you, kids, I mean, it's just actually, if you look at it, it's really quite concerning the way in which these leaders are actually unleashing all this horror. And who is at the receiving end? It is innocent civilians of all of this. And I think that, the world first and foremost has got to demand an end to the conflict from Israel, from Iran, from whoever is supporting and participating in this conflict. We have to demand cessation immediately, ceasefire immediately. No more lives have got to be lost. And then, I think that the issue of it expanding into the world, I mean, I think that definitely, there will be massive repercussions globally. We've seen threats by Israel that they will be targeting Iran's oil sources. I mean, obviously, that's going to have a ripple effect on the rest of the world. And, it's really not something that the world should sit by and just watch unfolding. It is something that countries that have some sensibility have to step in and really demand. And it's not just about demanding, Naledi. I mean, there have been numerous calls and demands on Israel, demands on the militant groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, demands on Iran to de-escalate. But I think now we've got to start seeing some sanctions being put down on countries that refuse to comply.
I'm going to just talk a little bit about the work of Amnesty International here, Shenilla, and say, what's the role of bodies such as Amnesty that, and I'm looking through, I suppose the identity of Amnesty, and it reads, our unwavering belief in the power of people united has brought about real change. And then at the end of who you are, you say, no government is beyond scrutiny. We uncover the truth. We hold human rights violators to account. The reason why I raise the identity of Amnesty International is even in that response, what I heard is really, I suppose, asking for a cessation and really walking the tightrope in the middle of that tension. Something that we've seen the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres doing, and that seeming to not work in his favor. So do we need a more decisive approach on saying, well, from a human rights point of view, lives lost on one end versus lives lost on another, perhaps the way to really look at it, and that's where international bodies need to be taking it?
Well, to start off on your question around Amnesty International, I mean, we are an evidence-based human rights research and human rights organization. So, even now, as we speak, we are on the ground, we are researching, we are gathering evidence on these violations. Now, you may be asking, well, what's the use of that when people are dying on a daily basis? But I will tell you that even when South Africa filed their ICJ application, they utilized Amnesty's evidence that we had gathered, in decades around the situation in Israel. We released we released numerous reports, and all of that is evidence that can be used in courts of law, because our evidence gathering is inscrutable. We have a very, very high level of quality assurance. We make sure we verify all of our information. So that is one role that we play, is that we gather the evidence that will eventually ensure that those that are guilty are brought to justice in the international court. The second thing that I think is really important is that we are about citizens utilizing their power. So you will have seen over the last couple of months and since the conflict broke out, that people have taken to the streets. And one of the roles that we do is we really support, encourage, coordinate, and really facilitate people to be able to go out into the street and demand of their leaders that they do the right thing. So it's really about evidence and people. Now, your question around, where are limitations? I mean, we have an international system for a reason. It was set up after the Second World War. The fact that countries are deliberately flouting, deliberately trying to dismantle the system is something we have to fight against. It's not a perfect system. And yes, Antonio Guterres does not have the power to go into a country and say, you know what, we are going to send soldiers and stop you immediately. But there is a system in place. There is legal levels. There's international law. And, while we may say, well, we don't see this working, ultimately we have to safeguard it because we don't have anything else, Naledi. If we take away these systems, the world will be in chaos. Antonio Guterres is doing his job as a UN Secretary General. He's trying to bring about, a de-escalation. And, these demands that he did not condemn this and he did not condemn that. I mean, for me, it's just another way of trying to delegitimize him and trying to delegitimize the United Nations. And we've seen that consistently. We've seen, countries flouting even recommendations or even directions that have come out of, bodies that are binding within the United Nations have been totally ignored. So, we have to ensure that the UN is in a way reformed to make sure that those more powerful countries do not have the power to just do as they like, which is what we're seeing here. But the truth of the matter is, Naledi, we can't give up. We have to carry on gathering our evidence. We have to carry on fighting for justice. We have to carry on shouting as loud as we can. Otherwise, the victims that are on the ground who are being annihilated in this brutality, they have no one to stand up for them.
I think one of the toughest questions now, as we watch tensions growing, and then you've got, of course, the sentiments that are shared from Israel on how the UN Secretary General is now even barred from entering Israel. An analyst saying here on the AM report yesterday is, once you've got divisions that impact the UN, then you certainly are at the brink of a World War III. You've got even the voices coming from Joe Biden, for instance, and some of the alleged interference by Russia. Would you characterize this as the beginning of a third world war? It's a tough one, but I'm curious.
I mean, I don't think so. I think from our perspective, we don't characterize things in that way. Is it a third world war? But I think what we have to look at is our attempts being made to de-escalate. I mean, if you think about the way in which Iran went about its attack, it did first, let the UN know. It did let America know. It did, and Iran has constantly said that we do not want to be drawn into a bigger conflict. So there are countries that are trying to de-escalate where they can. But unfortunately, you have, countries like Israel who are just going forward and really, spreading the war across the Middle East. Now, really, it all depends on what the bigger powers are able to do. Obviously, Russia, China haven't come into this conflict yet. But I mean, it's important not to underestimate and not to forget that they are there. I do think that there will be massive attempts at de-escalation. escalation. I do, hope that we do not get into a situation where, we brand this as a third world war or anything close to that. I think that there will be economic repercussions, definitely globally, but I do think there have been attempts at de-escalation. And the fact that the UN has been banned from Israel, I mean, I feel like, they, for me, I mean, they haven't been complying with anything that the UN has been saying, anything that the UN Security Council has told them to do. So for me, this is, just yet another, in a way, blatant and flagrant disregard of an international body that was set into place to protect the world.
Yeah.
Now, I think now, Naledi, the onus is on the other countries. Our focus has been very much on Israel, on the US, but what about all those other countries in the world? What are they doing? How are they stopping this? And I think that is where the responsibility now has to lie. We've seen what Israel, what Hamas, what Iran, what all of these countries are doing.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, what are the other countries prepared to do to stop us from tipping over the edge into what would be a massive global conflict?
That is quite the question that you're asking, because in fact, it's actually in our poll this morning where we're asking our viewers what African leaders should be doing, right? And should we, as Africa, as African leaders, as we watch the crisis in the Middle East expand, in our poll we're asking, should leaders speak out? Or should they stay out of it, or is it too late? And I just want to quickly share those results with you. 50% of people are saying we should stay out of it so far in that poll. 45% of the votes so far are saying speak out. 5% are saying it's too late. And I mean, it's quite interesting how people feel about it. And, then there's the question of, even if African leaders do speak out, what do they say? And perhaps you can shed light on that. But as we wrap up, please respond to that, what African leaders should be saying. And then you have also made a call for, I suppose, a mechanism that also needs to be in place with all the institutional infrastructure that we have in place globally, that there has to be a mechanism for crimes against humanity. Please unpack that as well for us, Shenilla, before we wrap up.
Thanks, Naledi. I mean, I think it's really, for me, quite surprising that 50% of your poll has said we should stay out. I think that the UN is a global organization of which African bodies African countries are members. And, Africa has to stop sitting on the fence. We have to get involved. We have to speak out. We have to really take up our space in those bodies loudly and clearly.
Yeah.
What is the message? The message is that we call for an end to all conflict. We call for a ceasefire. We call for the safeguarding of the international mechanisms like the ICJ. We call for, those perpetrators to be brought to account, whoever they are, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Israel. Every single life is critically important. So we call for that. And then I think, the fact that, we can't stay out of these conflicts because, like I said earlier, the economic ripple effects will hit Africa hard.
Yeah.
So we have to really make sure that, and if it escalates into a global conflict, well, of course, it's going to affect every single one of us.
Yeah.
So I think that, we can't sit on the fence. We have to step forward, and Africans have to do what is right, Naledi,
yeah,
not what others are driving them to do. And when it comes to international mechanisms, international mechanisms, I mean, we have the ICJ. It's not perfect, but we have to utilize it, and we have to make sure that those that are guilty are brought to account.
Yeah. A reminder to us of all of our responsibilities. Shenilla, thank you so much for speaking to us. We really do appreciate your time this early in the morning. Shenilla Mohamed is, of course, Amnesty International South Africa's Executive Director.